It was a chilly October evening in Atlanta, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the empty roads. Superior Court Judge Sandra Mitchell rubbed her tired eyes as she gathered her files from another demanding day at court. The case she'd presided over had been particularly challenging, a complex robbery trial that had stretched on for hours, testing her patience and wisdom. As she walked through the courthouse parking lot, her heels clicking against the pavement, she thought about the simple pleasure of the hot bath waiting for her at home. The clock on her dashboard read 9:45 p.m. when she pulled out onto the main road in her black Mercedes, a car she bought herself after 15 years of dedicated service to the justice system. The roads were quiet, with only a few cars passing by. Sandra hummed softly to her favorite jazz tune playing on the radio, her mind already drifting to tomorrow's schedule. She'd promised her daughter she'd make it to her basketball game, and despite her heavy caseload, she was determined to keep that promise. Just then, bright blue and red lights flashed in her rearview mirror, cutting through the peaceful night. Sandra checked her speedometer. She'd been going exactly at the speed limit. Years of legal experience told her something wasn't right, but she did exactly what she'd advised countless others to do: stay calm and follow procedure. She pulled it over carefully, positioning her car under a streetlight for visibility. Her heart began to race, not from fear, but from a familiar frustration she'd faced too many times before. She reached for her purse, taking out her license and registration before the officer even approached her car. Through her side mirror, she watched as the police officer stepped out of his patrol car. Officer James Cooper walked toward her vehicle with an exaggerated swagger, his hand resting near his holster. A gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Sandra's trained eye. She took a deep breath, turned down her radio completely, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. The beam from his flashlight swept through her car windows, unnecessarily bright and invasive. Sandra squinted against the harsh light but maintained her composure. She'd worked too hard, come too far, to let this moment get the better of her. "License and registration," Officer Cooper barked, not even bothering with a greeting. His tone carried that edge she'd heard too many times before, that automatic assumption of guilt that had nothing to do with her actions and everything to do with her appearance. "Good evening, officer," Sandra replied, her voice steady and clear. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" She reached slowly for the documents she'd already prepared. "Your taillight's out," he said, though Sandra knew for a fact she'd just had her car serviced last week. "And you were swerving." As she handed him her license and registration, she noticed his expression change slightly when he read her occupation. But instead of the usual respectful shift in demeanor that usually followed, his jaw tightened, and his grip on her documents became visibly firmer. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am," he ordered, his voice carrying an unmistakable note of challenge. Sandra felt her phone in her pocket, remembering the numerous discussions she'd led about citizens' rights and proper police procedure. In that moment, she had to make a choice, one that would set in motion a chain of events neither she nor Officer Cooper could have anticipated. Little did either of them know, this routine traffic stop was about to become a turning point that would change not just their lives, but their entire community's approach to law enforcement and racial justice. The real question wasn't about who was right or wrong, it was about who would have the courage to take the first step toward understanding. The night was about to get much longer, and this was just the beginning of a story that would eventually be shared in police academies and courtrooms across the country. Sandra took a deep breath and stepped out of her Mercedes, her movements deliberate and calm. The night air had grown colder, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the beam of Officer Cooper's flashlight. She'd been in tough situations before, both in and out of her courtroom, but this felt different. "Is there a problem, Officer Cooper?" she asked, noticing his name badge under the streetlight. She kept her voice steady and professional, the same tone she used when handling difficult cases in her courtroom. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just hours ago, she'd been the one in a position of authority, and now here she was, standing on the side of a dark road. "Hands where I can see them," Officer Cooper demanded, ignoring her question. His hand still hovered near his holster, a detail that made Sandra's heart beat faster despite her years of experience with law enforcement. "You matched the description of a suspicious vehicle in the area." Sandra almost laughed at the absurdity, Her car was a current year Mercedes-Benz, not exactly the typical vehicle for criminal activity in this neighborhood. "Officer, I'm Judge Sandra Mitchell from the Superior Court. I'm simply driving home from work." She reached slowly for her judicial ID, making sure her movements were visible and non-threatening. Officer Cooper's face twitched slightly at the mention of her title, but instead of backing down, he seemed to become more agitated. "Being a judge doesn't put you above the law, ma'am. I'm going to need you to put your hands on the hood of your car." A couple of cars drove past slowly, their drivers rubbernecking at the scene. Sandra felt the familiar weight of eyes on her, the same way she felt it her entire career, first as one of the few black women in law school, then as a prosecutor, and now as a judge. But she hadn't come this far to be humiliated on the side of the road. She reached into her pocket, deliberately pulling out her phone. "Officer Cooper, I'm going to record this interaction for both our safety. Could you please explain why you're asking me to place my hands on the vehicle when I've provided proper identification and haven't committed any violation?" The officer's radio crackled to life and he called for backup, claiming he had an uncooperative subject. Sandra felt a mix of anger and sadness. She'd heard stories like this countless times in her courtroom, but experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. "I've been nothing but cooperative, Officer Cooper," she said, her voice carrying the weight of her position without being confrontational. "But I also know my rights. I'd be happy to speak with your supervisor about this situation." Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars pulled up, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. One of the arriving officers, a younger woman, stepped out and immediately recognized Judge Mitchell from a community youth program she'd spoken at last month. "Judge Mitchell," the female officer said, surprise evident in her voice. "Is everything okay here?" The dynamic shifted instantly. Officer Cooper's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, embarrassment, and something else that caught Sandra's attention. It wasn't just shame she saw in his eyes. There was confusion there too, like someone whose worldview was beginning to crack. Standing there under the harsh street lights, Sandra made a decision that would change both their lives. Instead of filing a complaint or demanding immediate action, she saw an opportunity, a chance to turn this moment into something meaningful. "Officers," she said, addressing all of them now, "I think we need to have a conversation. Not here on the street, but a real discussion about what just happened and why it happened. Because this situation, it's bigger than just tonight." The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Officer Cooper stood frozen, his hand finally dropping from his holster, as the reality of who he'd been treating with such suspicion began to sink in. This wasn't going to be just another traffic stop story. This was about to become something much more important. The night wasn't over yet, and what would happen next would surprise everyone involved, sparking a change that would ripple through their entire community. The police station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Sandra sat in the conference room, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of mediocre coffee. It was nearly midnight now, but she knew this conversation couldn't wait until morning. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the most important ones to have. The station's night shift captain had arrived quickly after hearing a Superior Court judge was involved. He sat across from Sandra, his face etched with concern as she calmly recounted the evening's events. Officer Cooper sat at the far end of the table, looking smaller somehow without the authority of the darkened street behind him. "I want to be clear," Sandra said, setting down her coffee cup. "I'm not here to file a complaint or demand anyone's badge. I'm here because what happened tonight is a symptom of a bigger problem, and maybe, just maybe, we have a chance to turn this into something positive." The captain leaned forward, his nameplate catching the harsh light. "Judge Mitchell, we take these situations very seriously. Officer Cooper's behavior was completely unacceptable and disciplinary action." "That's exactly what I don't want," Sandra interrupted gently. "Another officer suspended, another mark in a file, and nothing really changes. We need something different here." Officer Cooper looked up for the first time since entering the room. His face showed a mix of confusion and relief, but mostly uncertainty. He clearly hadn't expected this turn of events. "Ma'am, Judge Mitchell," he corrected himself, his voice rougher than before. "I don't understand. You have every right to be angry, to demand consequences." Sandra turned to face him directly. "Officer Cooper, let me ask you something. When you first saw my car tonight, what went through your mind? Be honest. This isn't a trap. I genuinely want to understand. The room grew quiet. The young female officer who had recognized Sandra earlier stood by the door, watching intently. Even the usual bustle of the police station seemed to fade away. Officer Cooper shifted in his seat. I saw an expensive car in a neighborhood where we've had some recent incidents. But, he paused, struggling with his words. But I know that's not the whole truth. When I saw who was driving, he stopped again. When you saw a black woman behind the wheel, Sandra finished for him. Her voice wasn't angry, just matter of fact. Tell me about where you grew up, Officer Cooper. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He looked around the room, then back at Sandra. Small town in North Georgia. My daddy was a cop too. Didn't really know many people who didn't look like me until I moved to the city. And that shapes us, doesn't it? Sandra said softly. The world we grow up in, the things we're taught without even realizing we're learning them. But here's the thing, I'm not interested in shame or blame. I'm interested in change. She pulled out her calendar from her briefcase. I have a proposal. Instead of filing complaints or starting investigations, I want you to spend next week in my courtroom. Not as punishment, but as an opportunity. Watch how justice really works. See the people, all kinds of people, who come through those doors. Then maybe we can talk again. The captain started to object, citing scheduling concerns, but Sandra held up her hand. I'll make the necessary calls. Sometimes the best way to bridge a gap is to walk across it together. Officer Cooper's face showed a range of emotions, relief, embarrassment, and something that looked like hope. You'd do that? After how I treated you? Especially because of how you treated me, Sandra replied. Because next time, it might be someone without a judge's badge to protect them, and that person deserves better. We all do. The night shift was almost over, and the first hints of dawn were starting to show through the station's windows. What had started as a tense traffic stop was transforming into something none of them had expected. A chance for real understanding. As Sandra gathered her things to leave, Officer Cooper spoke up again. Judge Mitchell, thank you. I don't deserve this chance. Sandra paused at the door. It's not about deserving, Officer Cooper. It's about choosing to be better tomorrow than we were today. I'll see you in my courtroom on Monday morning. Monday morning arrived with a nervous energy in the air. Officer Cooper stood outside the courthouse, his civilian clothes feeling strange after years of wearing his uniform. He checked his watch, 8:45 a.m. Judge Mitchell had asked him to arrive early, and the last thing he wanted was to start this week by being late. The courthouse security guards gave him curious looks as he went through the metal detector. They were used to seeing him in uniform, bringing in suspects or testifying in cases. Today was different. Today, he was here to learn. The courtroom was already busy when he walked in. A mix of people filled the gallery. Families, lawyers in suits, defendants in everything from business wear to work clothes. He noticed something he'd never paid attention to before, how the tension in people's shoulders seemed to ease a bit when Judge Mitchell walked in. She didn't look anything like she had that night on the dark street. Dressed in her black robes, she carried herself with quiet authority. But there was something else too. A kindness in her eyes as she greeted everyone in her courtroom, from the lawyers to the cleaning staff. All rise, called the bailiff, and Officer Cooper stood with everyone else. As people settled back into their seats, he noticed Judge Mitchell give him a small nod of acknowledgement. The first case was a young man caught stealing food from a grocery store. Officer Cooper had handled dozens of similar cases on the street, usually just writing tickets and moving on. But watching it from here was different. Judge Mitchell listened carefully as the young man explained about losing his job and trying to feed his little sisters. Instead of just handing down a sentence, she asked questions about his job search, his skills, his family situation. Have you considered the city's job training program? She asked, pulling out a packet of information from her desk. And there's a food bank 3 blocks from your home. I want you to visit both this week and report back to me. Can you do that? The young man's eyes filled with tears. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor. Case after case, Officer Cooper watched as Judge Mitchell handled each situation with a mix of firmness and compassion. She was tough when needed. A drug dealer got no sympathy when he tried to blame others for his choices, but she also saw possibilities where others might have missed them. During the lunch break, Officer Cooper sat in the courthouse cafeteria, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. A public defender he recognized from various arrests sat down across from him. "Quite different seeing it from this side, isn't it?" she asked with a knowing smile. "It's not what I expected," he admitted. "She really listens to everyone, really tries to understand their stories." "That's why we call her the bridge builder," the defender said. "She sees people, not just cases, not just what they did wrong, but what they could do right with a little help." The afternoon session hit Officer Cooper even harder. A case came up that was eerily similar to one he'd handled last month, a teenager caught spraying graffiti. Last month, he'd arrested the kid without a second thought, but Judge Mitchell saw something else. "You're an artist," she said, looking at photos of the graffiti. "That takes talent. But right now, you're using that talent to destroy property. What if you could use it to create something instead?" She sentenced him to community service, painting murals at a local youth center under the guidance of a professional artist. The boy's face lit up with a hope that Officer Cooper had never seen during any of his arrests. As the day wound down, Officer Cooper stayed seated in the gallery, watching as Judge Mitchell handled her last few cases. He thought about all the quick judgments he'd made on the street, all the stories he'd never bothered to hear. Judge Mitchell noticed him still sitting there after she finished her last case. "First days can be overwhelming," she said, approaching him. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about how many stories I might have missed," he replied honestly. "How many chances to make a difference I might have overlooked." She smiled, gathering her papers. "That's a good place to start, Officer Cooper. That's a very good place to start. Ready for day 2 tomorrow?" He nodded, standing up. "Yes, Your Honor. I think I am." By Wednesday, Officer Cooper had started taking notes. It wasn't just about the cases anymore. He was noticing the little things. The way Judge Mitchell remembered everyone's names, even the courthouse cleaning staff who came in early morning. How she kept small bottles of water at her bench for nervous witnesses. The tissue box always within reach for those tough moments that sometimes happened in court. During the morning break, he sat in the courthouse garden, reviewing his notes from the past few days. A case from yesterday kept playing in his mind. A woman caught driving with a suspended license. 6 months ago, he would have just written the ticket and moved on, but Judge Mitchell had dug deeper. "Tell me why you were driving," she had asked. The woman explained about her sick mother, the late-night emergency, the choice between following the law and getting her mother to the hospital. Instead of a fine, she got connected with a program to help reinstate her license and a community service arrangement that worked around her caregiving schedule. Lost in thought, Officer Cooper almost didn't notice Judge Mitchell approaching with 2 coffee cups. She handed him one and sat on the bench nearby. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, sipping her coffee. "I keep thinking about that night," he admitted. "If you'd been anyone else, if you hadn't been a judge," he couldn't finish the sentence. "That's exactly why we're here," she said quietly. "Because it shouldn't matter if someone's a judge or a janitor. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity." A group of pigeons pecked at crumbs near their feet as they sat in comfortable silence. Finally, Officer Cooper spoke again. "My father was a cop for 30 years. He taught me everything I know about police work. But sitting in your courtroom, I'm learning there's so much he didn't teach me." Judge Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "Our parents give us their world as they knew it, but sometimes we have to build a better one. Tell me about your father." Officer Cooper stared into his coffee cup. "He was strict but fair, at least, that's what I always thought. Now I'm wondering if what I saw as fair was just familiar, comfortable, easy." "Change isn't easy," Judge Mitchell said, "but neither is staying the same when you know better. Yesterday, I saw you talking to Mrs. Chen from the translation services." He smiled slightly. "Yeah, I was asking about getting some basic Mandarin phrases for patrol. We've got a growing Chinese community in my sector, and I realized, well, how scary must it be when you can't even understand the officer's instructions?" Judge Mitchell's face lit up. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need more of. Understanding isn't just about following rules, it's about bridging gaps." The courthouse bells chimed, signaling the end of break. As they stood up, Officer Cooper remembered something else. "You know what really got me," he said. "That teenager yesterday, the one with the shoplifting charge. When his grandmother started crying, you paused the whole proceedings. Had your clerk bring her water, gave her time to compose herself. My old man would have called that a waste of court time." "Time spent showing humanity is never wasted," Judge Mitchell replied, ready to head back in. As they walked back to the courtroom, Officer Cooper noticed something else new. How people didn't tense up when he walked by, even in his civilian clothes. He realized it was because he was walking differently, seeing differently. "Judge Mitchell," he called as she reached the door to her chambers. "Thank you, not just for giving me this chance, but for showing me what justice really looks like." She turned back with a warm smile. "Justice isn't just about the law, Officer Cooper. It's about seeing the human being behind every case, every stop, every interaction. Remember that when you're back on patrol." The afternoon session was about to begin, and Officer Cooper took his seat in the gallery. His notebook was open, pen ready, but the most important lessons weren't the ones he was writing down. They were the ones changing his heart. Thursday brought rain to the city, and the courthouse halls were filled with the squeak of wet shoes and the rustle of damp umbrellas. Officer Cooper arrived early again, but this time with a different purpose. He'd asked Judge Mitchell's clerk if he could observe the morning preparations to understand how her day really began. He watched as she reviewed each case file, making notes about the people she'd see today. It wasn't just about their charges or legal history. She noted things like single parent, 3 kids, or lost job due to medical bills. Every detail that made each case more than just a number. "The files tell you what they did," she explained, noticing his interest. "But they rarely tell you why they did it. That's what we need to understand if we want to make real change." Later that morning, a case came up that hit close to home. A police officer had made an arrest that seemed questionable. The evidence was shaky, and the suspect's rights hadn't been properly explained. 6 months ago, Officer Cooper would have automatically sided with his fellow officer. But now he saw it differently. Judge Mitchell handled it with her usual grace. Instead of just dismissing the case and embarrassing the officer, she took time to explain why proper procedure matters. "When we protect everyone's rights," she said, "we protect the integrity of the whole system." During lunch, Officer Cooper sat with some courthouse staff in the cafeteria. They were surprised to see him there at first, but soon they were sharing stories and perspectives he'd never heard before. "You know what makes Judge Mitchell different?" said one clerk, stirring her soup. "She remembers that the biggest days in other people's lives are just Tuesday to us. That's why she gives every case her full attention." The afternoon brought a moment that would stick with Officer Cooper forever. A young boy, maybe 12, was waiting outside the courtroom with his mother. The boy looked terrified, and Cooper recognized that look. He'd seen it on countless faces during traffic stops and arrests. But then something beautiful happened. Judge Mitchell, spotting them on her way back from chambers, stopped to talk to the boy. She didn't speak down to him or try to scare him straight. Instead, she asked about his favorite subjects in school, his dreams for the future. "The law is important," she told him, "but so is kindness. Remember that, okay?" The boy's fear melted away, replaced by a small smile. His mother mouthed a silent thank you as Judge Mitchell walked away. Later, during a brief recess, Officer Cooper found himself in Judge Mitchell's chambers, looking at the photos on her wall. There were the usual certificates and awards, but also pictures of community events, graduation ceremonies, and people whose lives she touched. "Each one of those pictures has a story," she said, joining him. "Some of them started in handcuffs, just like the cases you bring in. But they didn't end there." "I've been thinking," Officer Cooper said slowly, "about how many stories I never bothered to learn. How many chances I missed to make a difference, not just an arrest." "That's the real power we have in our jobs," she replied, "not the authority to punish, but the opportunity to help people find a better path." As the day wound down, Officer Cooper watched Judge Mitchell handle her last case, a simple traffic violation that she turned into a teaching moment about responsibility and community. He realized that every interaction, no matter how small, was a chance to either build walls or bridges. Walking to his car that evening, he passed the spot where he usually parked his patrol car. The rain had stopped, and the setting sun was painting the wet streets with golden light. He thought about how different things looked from this side of the badge, this side of the bench. Tomorrow would be his last day in Judge Mitchell's courtroom, but he knew the real work would begin when he returned to patrol. He had new eyes now, new understanding. And maybe, just maybe, he could be the kind of officer who built bridges instead of walls. Friday came too quickly. Officer Cooper's last day in the courtroom felt different, like the last day of school when you know you've learned something that will change your life forever. He arrived extra early, bringing coffee for the security guards he'd gotten to know over the week. The morning docket was busy. A parade of cases that might have seemed routine a week ago now held new meaning. He watched a teenager get a second chance through a youth program, saw an elderly man get help with housing instead of a fine for vagrancy, witnessed a mother reunite with her children after completing drug treatment. During the morning break, one of the regular defense attorneys approached him. "I almost didn't recognize you without your uniform," she said. "You're the talk of the courthouse, you know. Not many officers would choose to spend a week here." "I didn't choose this," Officer Cooper admitted. "But now I'm grateful it happened. I've seen things differently this week." Back in session, a case came up that made Officer Cooper sit up straighter. Another police officer had brought in a man for resisting arrest. The story sounded familiar. A traffic stop gone wrong, escalating tensions, raised voices. But this time, Officer Cooper saw both sides of the story. Judge Mitchell handled it masterfully. She listened to the officer's testimony, then to the defendant's side. Instead of just ruling, she took a moment to address both men. "The law works best when there's understanding on both sides," she said. "Officer, while your concerns were valid, could this situation have been handled differently? And sir, while you had every right to question the stop, how might your reaction have contributed to the escalation?" Both men looked thoughtful. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about learning and growing. During lunch, Judge Mitchell invited Officer Cooper to share a meal in her chambers. She ordered sandwiches from the deli across the street, and they sat comfortably, like old friends, rather than people who'd met under such tense circumstances just a week ago. "So," she said, unwrapping her sandwich, "what's the biggest lesson you're taking back to patrol?" Officer Cooper thought carefully before answering. "I used to think my job was about enforcing the law, black and white. But now I see it's about serving people. The law is just the tool, humanity is the goal." Judge Mitchell smiled warmly. "That's exactly it. When we remember the humanity in others, we bring out the best in ourselves." The afternoon session brought a surprise. A familiar face appeared in the gallery. The police captain from that night at the station. He sat quietly, watching the proceedings, seeing firsthand what had changed one of his officers. As the day wound down, Officer Cooper found himself not wanting to leave. He'd grown comfortable in this courtroom, learned to see it as a place of hope rather than just punishment. But he knew his real test would come on Monday, back on patrol. Before he left, Judge Mitchell called him into her chambers one last time. On her desk was a small gift, a new notebook bound in leather. "For your patrol car," she explained. "To remind you that behind every traffic stop, every arrest, every interaction, there's a story. And you have the power to make that story better." Officer Cooper held the notebook carefully. "Thank you, Your Honor, for everything." "I have a feeling this isn't the end of our story," she replied. "In fact, I think it's just the beginning. Remember, Officer Cooper, you're not just enforcing the law anymore, you're building bridges." As he walked out of the courthouse that evening, his new notebook tucked safely in his jacket, Officer Cooper felt different. Monday would bring new challenges, new opportunities to apply what he'd learned. But now he had new eyes to see with, a new heart to serve with. A group of pigeons scattered as he reached his car, reminding him of that conversation in the courthouse garden. Change isn't easy, but staying the same is harder once you know better. And he knew better now. Much better. Monday morning felt strange, putting on the police uniform again. Officer Cooper adjusted his badge, the metal catching the early morning light. The weight of it felt different now, less like authority and more like responsibility. His new notebook sat on the passenger seat of his patrol car, ready for its first day on the job. His first call came before sunrise, a noise complaint at an apartment complex. In the past, he would have just shown up, told everyone to quiet down, and maybe written a ticket. But today, he tried something different. The noise turned out to be an elderly grandmother practicing English with her grandchildren before school. Instead of issuing a warning, he spent 5 minutes helping them adjust their TV volume and learned that the grandmother was preparing for her citizenship test. "Here's my card," he told her, writing a note on the back. "There's a free citizenship prep class at the community center. They can help you study." Back in his patrol car, he made a note in his new notebook: "Follow up with Mrs. Chen about translation services for the citizenship class." Later that morning, he spotted a car with a broken taillight, just like the night he'd stopped Judge Mitchell. But this time, he approached the driver's window with a different attitude. "Good morning," he said, keeping his hands visible and his voice friendly. "I noticed your taillight is out. Everything okay?" The driver, a young man in work clothes, looked terrified. "Officer, I just started a new job. I was going to fix it on payday, I promise." Instead of writing a ticket, Officer Cooper pulled out his resource guide, something he put together during his week in court. "There's a program that helps with car repairs. Here's their information. Get it fixed within 2 weeks, bring the receipt to the station, and we'll mark this as a warning, okay?" The young man's relief was visible. "Thank you, officer. Thank you so much." Throughout the day, Officer Cooper found himself handling situations differently. A shoplifting call at the grocery store turned into connecting a homeless veteran with VA benefits. A teenage skateboarder causing trouble outside a business became a conversation about starting a youth program in the empty lot nearby. During his lunch break, he parked near the courthouse. Looking up at the building, he remembered Judge Mitchell's words about making every interaction count. His notebook was already filling up with names, situations, and follow-up tasks. The afternoon brought a tough test, a traffic stop that could have gone badly. The driver was angry, defensive, just like he had been that night with Judge Mitchell. But instead of escalating, Officer Cooper tried understanding. "Sir, I can see you're upset," he said calmly. "Can you tell me what's going on? Maybe we can figure this out together." The man's anger deflated slightly. He'd just lost his job, his kid was sick, and he was running on empty, literally and figuratively. Officer Cooper remembered a case from Judge Mitchell's court about a father in a similar situation. "Let's talk about some resources that might help," he said, pulling out his resource guide again. "Your family's well-being is more important than this ticket." Near the end of his shift, the police captain called him in. On his desk was a letter, a thank you note from the grandmother he'd helped that morning. She'd already signed up for the citizenship class. "This is different from your usual reports," the captain said, but he was smiling. "I learned from the best," Officer Cooper replied, thinking of Judge Mitchell's courtroom. As he drove home that evening, he passed the spot where he'd made that fateful traffic stop. A week in court had changed everything. How he saw his job, his community, himself. His notebook had several pages filled now, each entry a chance to make a difference. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new stories. But now he had new tools to handle them, not just his badge and uniform, but understanding, compassion, and the knowledge that every interaction was a chance to build a bridge. He thought about Judge Mitchell and smiled. Sometimes the best lessons come from our biggest mistakes. And sometimes a traffic stop can change not just a life, but an entire approach to justice. 3 months after that life-changing week in court, Officer Cooper stood before a room full of police cadets at the training academy. His notebook, now filled with stories and experiences, sat on the podium beside him. Judge Mitchell sat in the back of the room, watching with quiet pride. "When I started on the force 12 years ago," he began, "I thought I knew everything about being a good police officer. But it took one traffic stop and one extraordinary judge to show me how much I had to learn." The cadets leaned forward, interested. They'd heard rumors about the officer who'd stopped a judge and ended up changing the whole department's approach to community policing. "Last week, I dealt with a situation that shows what I mean," he continued. "We got a call about teenagers causing trouble at the community center. The old me would have shown up with lights flashing, ready to make arrests. Instead, I found out they were trying to practice dance moves but had nowhere to go." He smiled, remembering. Now those kids have permission to use the community center's back room after hours. They're preparing for a dance competition next month. And you know what? Reports of youth problems in that area have dropped by half. In the months since his week in court, Officer Cooper had started a new program called Bridge Builders, training officers to connect with community resources and see beyond just enforcement. Judge Mitchell had helped, opening her courtroom to other officers who wanted to learn. Your badge gives you authority, he told the cadets, but your humanity gives you influence. Every person you meet is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's hope for the future. He shared more stories: the grandmother who'd passed her citizenship test, the young man who'd fixed his taillight and was now helping others do the same, the teenager from the shoplifting case who was now mentoring younger kids. But here's the most important thing I learned, he said, picking up his notebook. Every day gives us a choice. We can build walls, or we can build bridges. We can enforce laws, or we can lift lives. After the presentation, Judge Mitchell approached him. They'd stayed in touch, working together to expand the program. Those cadets were really listening, she said. You're making a real difference. I had a good teacher, he replied. Actually, I wanted to show you something. He led her to the police station's community room, where the walls were now covered with resource information, contact numbers, and success stories. In the center was a framed photo of that first graduating class from their Bridge Builders program. Remember that night you could have filed a complaint, he asked. Instead, you chose to build a bridge. Now look at how many people have crossed it. Judge Mitchell smiled, touching the frame. Sometimes the best decisions are the hardest ones. Speaking of which, how's your study group going? Officer Cooper grinned. He'd started helping other officers prepare for the sergeant's exam, sharing not just procedures but perspectives. 5 of them take the test next month, but we spend as much time talking about community building as we do about regulations. As they walked out into the evening air, they passed 2 officers talking with a group of teenagers, not confronting them, but really listening. One officer was taking notes in a familiar-looking notebook. It's spreading, Judge Mitchell observed, like ripples in a pond. That's how change happens, Officer Cooper replied. One story, one person, one moment at a time. Looking back at that night 3 months ago, he could hardly believe how much had changed. A traffic stop that could have ended in anger had instead sparked a movement. Now, officers across the department were learning to see their role differently, not just as enforcers of the law, but as builders of community. And it all started because one judge chose understanding over anger, and one officer learned to see beyond his badge. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. Sometimes a mistake can become a miracle. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build bridges. But now, they were ready. They were changing. They were growing. And somewhere in the city, another story was waiting to begin.